Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Track Car Obsession. On this episode, I'm going to show you how to remove the rear differential and your CV axles from your RX-8. Stay tuned. Okay, so before we get started on the differential and the axle removal, I just want to catch you up on what I've done off camera to the RX-8 since the last video. The last video showed us removing the engine. Since then, what I've done is taken out all of the wiring, all of the last little bit of insulation and everything to get ready for any type of fabrication that's needed for the motor swap. So as you can see in the interior, last time we had removed the interior, there were still all the wiring, and if you had watched the interior video, you remember I left the bar here and just took off the plastic part of the dash that had all the gauges and everything in it. There was actually one last bolt that was over here that I couldn't see after removing all of these other ones. So I took that out because it really needed to come out. And the pedals and the air box and or the heater box and the AC and everything like that had to come out in order to really be able to get to the firewall, make any adjustments there, and to fully get access to all of the sound deadening for us to be able to take that out. So I've got all of this out. Every single bit of wiring is out. In fact, I'll show it to you right here. It is a lot of wiring, and I'm gonna need very little of it. I'm pretty much converting everything to manual. So the windows are gonna be manual, the locks are gonna be manual. I'm not gonna need any of the body harness really, other than ABS, which I'm going to attempt to keep with the motor swap, and then the headlights, taillights, turn signals, that kind of stuff. So then what I've also done underneath the hood is basically the same thing. I pulled out all the wiring and pulled out all the insulation that went across the firewall, and then down the sides over the wheel wells, and then pulled out the AC. I had a friend come by and remove all the refrigerant from it. You don't want to release that into the atmosphere. So, you know, make sure that you get that released into a recovering tank, and then disconnect that. So I've done all this. All of that would have been very boring for you guys to watch. So I've done that off camera. And now we're going to get to removing the last bit of the drivetrain that's in the car. So let's get started. Okay, so the first thing that you're going to do when you're removing the rear differential, if you're removing the CV axles as well, is while the drivetrain is still hooked up, your transmission and drive shaft and everything, throw it into gear and put the e-brake on, and that way you can break these 35mm axle nuts loose. Once those are broken loose, you can go ahead and start breaking everything down. If you're not removing the CV axles, if you're just changing your rear differential, you don't have to worry about doing that, because then when you take off the hub, you're just going to pull the axle out from the differential and leave it attached here, so you don't even have to worry about that. So once that's done, the next thing you're going to do is disconnect the rear differential from the PPF, from the brace that runs back from the transmission to the rear differential, and as well as dislocate the drive shaft from your rear differential. And if you don't know how to do that, just click up in the top corner here. I'm going to link the video that I did removing the engine, and you'll see how to remove those two things from the car. So now that we've got that done, I've actually already broken this loose. So we're going to take this off. And there's a couple ways that you can do this. You can either remove it from all the points here. You basically have several ball joints because it is a multi-link rear suspension. So there's 5 connections, give or take, on the back here to your hub assembly and to your subframe in the rear. So if you disconnect it, it can be easier to disconnect it from the subframe because there aren't any ball joints, and if you don't have a ball joint remover or a tie rod end remover or anything like that, sometimes the ball joints can be a pain. So you can remove it from the subframe. Now unfortunately, if you do remove them from the subframe, that's where your alignment settings are. There's camber bolts in there, and if you disconnect those when you do this, when you put them back, you will have to get an alignment just to make sure that everything's lined up the way it's supposed to be. So we're going to go ahead and try and remove it from the ball joints here. And then if any of them stick, again, we can always pull them from the subframe, and the alignment doesn't really matter because I'm going to be changing all of this out anyway. But if you're not trying to redo your alignment, you just want to change out your differential for whatever reason, it may be best just to disconnect it from the hub and then pull the whole assembly out. And then that way you can put in the new differential, pop this in, you don't have to worry about an alignment. So I'm going to show you which ones to disconnect. The first thing that we're going to do is disconnect the ABS. Now you can disconnect the ABS sensor from the hub itself and pull it out. I've removed the entire wiring harness from the car, so I've just pulled out the connector right here, so it's not going to get stuck. Then the next thing that we're going to do is take off the brake caliper in the rear, and it is two 14mm bolts, I believe. Now when you remove your rear caliper, or if you're removing a front caliper anywhere, always make sure that you use something, whether it's a bungee cord or a zip tie, to hold the brake caliper in place so all the weight isn't held on the brake line itself. And it's a good idea, if you've had bolts that haven't come loose in a while, to go ahead and hit it with some penetrating oil like PB Blaster or something. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do is go ahead and break loose all of these nuts. Now another thing I do want to mention is on the driver's side, you may have a level sensor. I don't know if that has to do with the DSC, the stability control, or if that has to do with the headlight leveling system. Either way, I've already pulled that off because that's something that I ripped out with the wiring harness because it's not something I'm going to need. But you will need to disconnect that as well. The other 14mm bolt that we need to take off is for your anti-sway bar. All right, and the bigger nuts on the rear suspension here are going to be a 19. All right, and the last bolt that you need to undo is on the bottom of your coilover or rear shock assembly. It's going to be a 17mm bolt that goes right into the bottom of the hub assembly. All right, and now that this bolt is out, we just need to push the pin down or the end of the ball joint. Everything else is loose. Now what you do here is usually use a ball joint remover or a tie rod end remover. But what I've done, like I said, because I'm removing or replacing these arms anyway, I'm just gonna put the nut on the end of this and just hit the nut to knock the ball joint loose. I wouldn't normally recommend doing that because you could probably damage the threads on your ball joint. Then you'll have to replace the arms. Just use the tools. Otherwise, like I said, you can disconnect it from the subframe. You don't have to have any special tools. But then when you do that, you will have to get an alignment again. So just keep that in mind. All right, that one's loose. That one's loose. All right, so now that it's pretty loose, we just have it connected to a couple of things here. There's room in the CV axle. Now, of course, if you're leaving the CV axle here, you're pretty much done on this part. Just kind of set it over to the side, and then when you get under and pry the CV axle from the differential, that's all you'll have to do because you'll keep the CV axle attached to the hub. I'm actually removing the axle from the hub. So what I'm going to do is just I've got to put custom axles in here with the new drivetrain. So I'm just going to throw the old nut on here and hammer it out. Sometimes you can get by without a damage in the threads. If you try and hit this without the nut on there, a lot of times you will damage the end and then have trouble getting the nut on there. So use a press or something like that if you have to. But again, I'm just gonna get this thing apart because a lot of the stuff's getting replaced. Okay, so see, we damaged the nut, but when you're replacing your CV axle anyway, manufacturer recommendation is to replace this. So we're not gonna need this. So all we're gonna do is wiggle it loose from its last couple mounts here. All right, and that's it. All right, well, apparently it's starting to rain now, so I apologize if there's a lot of background noise here, but that's just the rain hitting the roof. So with the hub out, you can see a good reason why rubber bushings from the factory are not good for the racetrack. And what you get here is all this binding. So all this rubber that's on the bushings here, it's causing this binding. And see, what that does is it actually fights against your springs and your shock absorbers and doesn't allow them to do what they're supposed to do. I mean, obviously they still work, but not to the full extent that they could. And so if you're not worried about NVH or the noise vibration harshness that the manufacturer has to worry about when you're driving it on the street, if it's actually a track car, what you want to do is get rid of this rubber that's binding and at least upgrade it to polyurethane. Polyurethane is not the best. It's a good compromise if you do still drive it on the street, but it's definitely better than these rubber bushings that bind up. The best thing to do is either go with a Delrin bushing or go completely solid with like a Heim joint or something. So this clearly shows the binding that you get with rubber bushings, and that's on every single connection here. And so they just multiply that effect across your shock absorber and spring, so you don't get the maximum effect from a good track setup without going to new bushings. So definitely recommend replacing those if you're going to do some serious track driving or racing. All right, so now that we have the hub off, the CV is disconnected from the hub. We're going to get under the car and disconnect the CV from the differential. I've already done the other side, but obviously you would repeat this on the other side yourself. And then once we get this axle out, there's two mounts that we're going to remove from the subframe and then drop the actual differential itself. I currently have it sitting on a jack, and that way we can lower it. So let's get to it. Okay, so now that we're under the car, you can see all you've got to do is take a pry bar or a crowbar or something like that and wedge it between the differential and the CV axle and just give it a quick little pop, and you'll get it past the C-clip, and then it'll slide right out. So let's go ahead and do that. Well, that was a pretty violent CV removal, but your C-clip is right here. So right here on the end, there's actually a piece in the carrier inside your differential that this pops into, and that's what keeps the CV axle inside the differential. It keeps it from popping out. So now that that's removed, let's go ahead and get to the bolts on the differential. Okay, so right there you can see on the ear of the differential there's what looks to be a 19mm bolt, and you've got the same thing on the other side. You just want to make sure that you have the differential supported, and then start undoing those bolts on each side, and then you should be able to lower it. Now you can try and keep this as level as possible and not spill any fluid, or go ahead and remove fluid from the differential so you don't have to worry about any mess. All right, so we've got both bolts out of the differential. We're gonna go ahead and lower the jack and see if we can get it down without dumping gear oil everywhere. All right, so the ears stick out too far in the back, so we also have to push the differential forward as we lower it down. All right, guys, well, that's all there is to it. We've got the differential out. Now, I said that these looked like 19mm bolts. They're actually 17mm bolts. So pretty much everything can be done with 14mm, 17, and 19mm, as long as a 35mm socket to remove the axle nut if you are removing the CVs. But if you're just removing the differential, you don't have to worry about that. Now the PPF to remove these are a 21mm, so you will need a 21mm deep, and then 14mm for the differential. And again, I've got that linked, and I'll put the link to the video of removing the drive shaft and the drivetrain brace, the PPF. I'll link that video in the description below. Now, if you're doing this to remove and replace the differential bushings, here they are right here. You'll just get these pressed out and put new ones in. If you need to replace a broken differential, or if you purchased one with a different gear ratio, whatever, you'll just remove these nuts, pull this bracket off, put the new differential, put this onto the new differential, and then throw it back up into the car and just do the reverse process. Now again, if you removed the bolts from the subframe and not from the spindle, then what you're going to need to do is make sure that you go get an alignment, and that way you don't have any dangerous driving conditions or uneven wear on your tires. But thank you so much for watching. Make sure that you like and subscribe this video, and we'll come back at you in a couple more days with more progress on the RX-8. Thank you.
Take it easy.